On a September day 5 years ago, a 55-year-old man named David McBride stepped off a plane from Spain to return to Sydney. Still reeling from a relatively recent divorce, McBride was adamant that no matter the cost, he was going to remain a steadfast father. His return home wasn't without risk. After all, the Australian Federal Police had raided his Sydney residence while abroad, but the risk didn't matter. This was the day of his daughter's father-daughter school dance, and very little could stand in the way of him being there. Except for a set of AFP officers. As McBride exited the plane, the officers immediately arrested him, charged him with violating the Defence Act, and put him in a Surrey Hills prison. 5 years later, he faces unlimited prison.
David McBride faces life imprisonment because that's what the penalty is. It's a limitless penalty under the Defence Act.
To me, it really feels like there is an engine pushing this prosecution forward that is far more powerful than the Australian government.
I've committed a crime, I'll go to jail. I'm all about the rule of law.
You don't rat on your mates. Well, I think this bloke is ratted on his mates.
So just this month, David McBride's criminal trial began. It's a huge landmark case for, on the one hand, whistleblowing in Australia, and then on the other, for actually punishing war crimes perpetrated by Australians. And just to cover myself for contempt of court, I have no desire to influence the jurors. Quite frankly, both sets of lawyers can make an argument far better than me. I just want to unpack the actual case. And so the subject of today's video is to do with what Australian soldiers did in the Afghanistan war. Now, of course, the war itself was predicated on Bush's ultimatum to the Taliban: hand over you-know-who or be invaded. Sorry, I don't quite have enough patrons to sacrifice monetization. Of course, the Taliban didn't. Prime Minister Howard was quick to support Bush in a full-scale invasion of Afghanistan with a stated goal of regime change.
Other close friends, including Canada, Australia, Germany, and France, have pledged forces as the operation unfolds. And now, the Taliban will pay a price.
By November of 2001, the Taliban had largely evacuated Kabul, and after the Battle of Tora Bora in December, the CIA's most wanted man fled into hiding and would eventually cross into Pakistan. The repression of the Taliban happened at lightning pace, but what was much slower was in installing a replacement government. Local warlords came to claim evacuated territories. Because of this, tribal leader Hamid Karzai was parachuted in as the new president of Afghanistan. The Taliban had been obliterated at lightning pace, and now pushed to the outskirts of Afghanistan, they had to regroup to try and take back control of their state. To prevent this, Bush needed the help of his allies, and Howard was all too willing to put his hand up.
We are with you in the fight against terrorism, and we remain committed with our coalition partners to contributing to the strengthening of your country.
Australia formed part of the International Security Assistance Force. Over the course of 4 stages, Australia was to help ISAF expand from Kabul to suppress the Taliban in the outskirts of Afghanistan. From 2006 to 2008, coalition forces grew from 9,000 to 51,000. When Obama came in, he promised a withdrawal from Afghanistan, though conceded he temporarily needed to increase the US presence. When Howard lost, his successor, Kevin Rudd, continued to support Australian involvement in Afghanistan and argued that it was just Iraq that was the bad war. He argued for transitioning soldiers across from Iraq and to Afghanistan. So by the end of the 2000s, the mission was clear: finish off the Taliban and keep Karzai's Afghan government secure. So,
I certainly do not want to see the Parliament of Australia approving the conduct of someone that's ratted on his mates.
how does David McBride fit into all of this?
Most un-Australian of characterisations.
So David McBride's background is fascinating and at times, quite frankly, bizarre. So he's an Aussie who studied law at Oxford and while over there, joined the British Army. Yep, there was no issue in him doing that. So as a British soldier, he commanded a platoon in Northern Ireland while bomb and sniper attacks were directed towards the British. After this, he then unsuccessfully applied for the SAS, and then in the 90s, he actually appeared on a British TV show called The Wanted, where people had to escape a tracker.
Hello, my name is Ray Coates, and for the next 60 minutes, you are wanted!
One of which was McBride. But wait, there's still more. So McBride then returned to Australia where he became a staffer for Liberal MP Peter King. He was the guy who held Wentworth before Turnbull. Then after that, he ran for the seat of Coogee in the 2003 New South Wales election, but lost to Labor. At that point, he ended his political ambitions and became a lawyer for the Defence Force and was twice deployed to Afghanistan in 2011 and 2013. Again, this was the era of suppressing the Taliban. Now, according to McBride, very quickly did he become disillusioned with the state of the Australian Army. For McBride, everything was simply politicised. When things weren't going well, a positive news story would break.
And I'd like to turn our attention to Afghanistan for a moment, and news overnight of another Australian soldier being wounded highlights the dangers for our troops serving there. I had the honour of meeting some of these brave men and women recently.
If the narrative needed a hero, a war hero would be created, and if the Afghan narrative lost momentum, the Taliban would only be further vilified.
Australian troops could be in Afghanistan for at least another decade, with the Prime Minister warning the country must never again become a haven for terrorists.
Of course, any shortcomings of the Afghan allies would be glossed over. And according to McBride, this was because the army leadership wanted to look good for promotions. At the more extreme end, McBride even suggested that Victoria Cross medals were decided on such fickle matters as someone's appearance and marketability. As McBride has said, he's adamant he foresaw the collapse of the Afghan government.
And it came no surprise to me that in 2021, the whole regime that we'd installed collapsed in a day. Now, most insiders could see that was going to happen.
As 2012 rolled into 2013, rumours started to circle of Australians committing murders in Afghanistan. Now, according to McBride, a low-ranking soldier was cannon fodder for the media and not tough to report on. To be honest, finding some low-ranking scapegoats would actually serve the image of the army leadership well. But if he was going to report on the culture of the leadership, a culture that covered up murders and routinely misrepresented the situation in Afghanistan, there would be very few support networks. Quite simply, there was no independent body for investigating this stuff. So, firstly, McBride made an internal complaint, but complaints were heard by the Chief of Defence, and given the complaint was about the Chief of Defence, nothing more was made of it. So, returning home from his 2013 tour, McBride was stationed in the High Security Joint Operations Headquarters, about a half hour from Canberra. In 2014, he'd periodically gather top secret files, drive home, and then compile them into a dossier. Eventually, he gave that dossier over to the ABC. The ABC remained silent on this until 3 years later when they released the Afghan files, an expose on the dirty laundry of the Australian Army. And what these files revealed was, quite frankly, horrific. A murder of a Taliban detainee while waiting for a helicopter transfer, Australian Special Forces soldiers killing an unarmed Afghan man and his sleeping child, a murder of an Afghan motorcyclist which agitated the Afghan authorities so much they threatened to stop working with Australia entirely, a fraught relationship between the SAS in Perth and the commandos in Sydney, and even one involving current Liberal MP Andrew Hastie.
You were deployed yourself as an SAS captain in 2013, a deployment that was marred by civilian casualties and the treatment of some Taliban fighters. Must say you were the whistleblower in that instance.
Hastie was an SAS captain and one of his men severed a hand to obtain fingerprints. He was under time pressure and had to get back to the helicopter. However, severing the hands of the dead is a war crime, and in 2013 the story broke and the soldier was widely condemned. The Afghan files actually showed that the SAS soldier was encouraged to do this by the Australian Defence Force Investigative Service at a training session 9 days before. It seemed as though the senior leadership let the soldier be a scapegoat when he was just following instructions. It is also worth adding that Hastie immediately reported this. Now, being a lawyer for the army, it was obvious who had access to these files and therefore who leaked it to the press: McBride. But here's the really interesting thing. McBride kind of wanted a trial. Let me explain what I mean. So if the charges were dropped against McBride, then the story would kind of be forgotten about and blur into the background. However, a high-profile court case would put the Australian military front and centre and give McBride a chance to make his case before the whole nation that the army had lost its way. But remember, it was obvious that he did it, and so it'd be very easy for the government to prove guilt. When the AFP arrested him in 2018, they charged him with just one offence: breaching the Commonwealth Criminal Code by stealing Commonwealth property. In 2019, he was then charged with 4 further offences for unlawfully disclosing a Commonwealth document under the Defence Act. So, apart from McBride saying that the system sucks, what could possibly be his legal defence when he's admitted to doing it? Well, there are a few parts to it. The first argument of his defence is that he's being charged under public interest laws, and simply, there's no public interest in his prosecution. As McBride argues, the only thing in those files was embarrassment, and certainly nothing of strategic value. Other Army officials like Mark Donaldson have well publicised the strategic elements of those documents with their autobiographies.
There's no damage to national security. Someone asked me about it yesterday to say, really, murders on a hilltop in Afghanistan 10 years ago, we can't, the Chinese need to find out about that, do they?
And so McBride firstly argued that there was no public interest in his prosecution. So this brings about defence number 2. The law is only functional if it is applied consistently and with impartiality. According to McBride, that he's the only person charged with anything from the Afghan war is an indication that the law is being used as a bludgeoning tool to go after dissenters. And finally, McBride argued that under the Public Interest Disclosure Act, essentially whistleblowing laws that Labor brought in right before losing to Abbott, he had a legal duty to do what he did. Essentially, his actions weren't a violation of the law, but were in fact ensuring the upholding of the law. So, given that McBride was charged with a federal offence, the government was responsible for providing the prosecution. Except in Western governments, especially ours, the government changes hands all the time, and so too does the Attorney General who could prevent the prosecution.
This, of course, allows Julia Gillard to become the first woman Prime Minister.
The government of Australia has changed.
A little while ago, I met with the Prime Minister and advised him that I would be challenging him for the leadership of the Liberal Party.
The successful candidate was Scott Morrison.
So from the time of the arrest until 2021, the Attorney General of Australia was Christian Porter. He's pretty infamous now for other reasons. As it was clear that McBride would not plead guilty, and as it was clear that a trial would in fact go ahead, growing pressure came for Porter to intervene and stop the prosecution. Porter's answer was very simple: no. It would require a more extreme case to even consider intervening. However, the Liberal Party also faced growing political pressure on the issue. In 2019, the AFP raided the ABC over the leaks that led to the Afghan files.
Australian federal police officers are this afternoon continuing to raid the ABC's Sydney headquarters. It's over a series of 2017 stories known as the Afghan files.
This was universally condemned across the world as a blatant act of intimidation. The next year in 2020, this news story broke.
A bombshell report has accused Australian Special Forces soldiers of unlawfully killing dozens of Afghan civilians. 19 soldiers now face possible criminal charges.
Essentially, this report began in 2016 and took nearly half a decade to complete. It was conducted by Major Paul Brereton and found evidence to suggest 39 murders of civilians and prisoners were covered up by senior ADF personnel. And the report wasn't just damning because of the murders. It was the nature of the murders. There were two things that were particularly concerning. One, something called throwdowns, essentially where a weapon would be planted next to the body to appear as a combat kill. And two, something called blooding, i.e. initiating a junior soldier by having them murder someone under their control. Some of this footage was particularly horrific. The Brereton report put immediate pressure on the Liberal Party to act decisively. Prime Minister Morrison announced a new Special Investigators Office to follow up any further war crimes. Home Affairs Minister Dutton chose the investigator, and then Defence Minister Linda Reynolds said she felt physically ill reading the report.
And it made me physically ill, and it was a very distressing read.
The Executive Director of the Australian Defence Association even said that this was the first incidence of systemic rather than isolated Australian war crimes. Surely this only validated McBride's claims, right? Surely an easy PR move for the Libs would be to have Porter drop the prosecution. Well, he didn't. McBride's lawyer and ex-Senator Nick Xenophon went on Q&A to plead McBride's case, but still, Porter refused to drop the charges. Fast forward to the 2022 election and we saw a change of government.
And I say to my fellow Australians, thank you for this extraordinary honour.
But I want to draw your attention to one part of the campaign. The Libs completely wedged Labor on national security, and their entire campaign was more or less on Labor being soft on China. To counter this, Albanese's government just matched the Liberals on anything national security. The strategy worked, and Labor came to government. But the new Attorney General, Mark Dreyfus, was in no hurry to block McBride's prosecution. But in 2022, yet another thing gave life to McBride's case.
Many Australians will always believe Ben Roberts-Smith was only ever a valiant soldier, only ever doing his job, putting his life on the line in an attempt to defeat the brutal Taliban in Afghanistan. The truth, however, is very different.
So this guy, Benjamin Robert Smith, won a Victoria Cross Medal in 2011 and is currently Australia's most decorated living soldier. However, after the Afghan files were published in 2017, his actions in Afghanistan came under scrutiny as he was accused of committing war crimes both before and after receiving his medal, including murder. This was covered by Fairfax's Nick McKenzie and the ABC's Dan Oakes. Robert Smith responded by suing Fairfax and McKenzie himself for defamation. Fairfax's defence was that it was true, and so interestingly, Robert Smith was effectively on trial for murder, but in a civil court rather than a criminal one. During the trial, plenty of soldiers were called to give evidence, and the judge came to the conclusion that Robert Smith did in fact commit 4 murders, while 2 of the allegations remained unproven. As a result, using the term war criminal to describe Robert Smith was not an act of defamation.
Decorated war soldier Ben Robert Smith's defamation case has been dismissed by a federal court judge. Justice Anthony Basanko finding the Victoria Cross recipient to have committed war crimes in Afghanistan.
So once again, this only seemed to confirm everything that McBride had been saying, and yet there was still no dropping of the charges. And just to clarify, McBride has said he'd be disappointed if the charges were in fact dropped. Now, remember that 3-pronged defence that McBride took? The third point being that it was his legal duty to report on the alleged war crimes. Well, this part of the defence relied on the calling of 2 witnesses. However, the prosecution successfully argued that these 2 witnesses would compromise national security. What this means is that McBride has dropped that part of his defence entirely and is now purely arguing that the law has been applied inconsistently and that there's no public interest in his prosecution. As a result, there was no alternative but to go to trial this month. But to properly understand Australia's origins in the Afghan war, we need to understand the greatest Prime Minister Australia's ever had, John Howard. Except, I'm going to argue he's certainly not the greatest. This one I can editorialise on. Click here to check it out.